I also became involved in the death penalty as an expert in Eric Nenno's case. And that's why I am a witness at Eric's execution last night. That's why I chose to witness the execution, because it wasn't something that was distant from me. It wasn't an objective case that I had read about. I knew Eric. I had interviewed Eric in jail prior to his trial. I had been retained as an expert by one of the attorneys that represented him during his trial. I had worked for that attorney on a number of non-capital cases in prediction of future criminality, trying to help the then defendant be given probation should he be convicted, rather than having him sent to prison on usually drug-related charges. Sometimes they were sex offense-related charges. Sometimes they were burglary of a habitation. But I had worked for him as an expert in pre-sentencing situations, and had been actually testifying in cases that are non-capital, having to do with prediction of future criminality. So that was one of the areas that I had been certified as an expert in, and had done some research. I worked with the Texas Probation Commission at the time that they were modifying their pre-sentencing instrument, and I validated Texas's pre-sentencing classification instrument that was used in courts throughout Texas to determine, or help judges determine, whether to sentence someone to prison or whether to sentence them to probation or community supervision. So my role as an expert in classification and prediction of future criminality had been certified, but never in a capital case prior to Eric Nenno's case. The judge in Eric Nenno's case gave his attorney sufficient funds to hire me as an expert, and I interviewed Eric in jail, and I was prepared to testify during his sentencing phase. I was at the court prior to the day of his sentencing. So there was really never a trial about guilt or innocence, but there was a trial about the next question: what are we going to do with this monster who has brutally murdered and raped and then hidden the body of a 7-year-old neighbor? And so my interview with Eric in jail showed Eric to be a very pleasant young man. At that time, by then, he had acknowledged what he had done. He was aware of it. He was hugely remorseful. He was just almost to a point of despondent because of what he had done and how he couldn't undo it. And that was part of the testimony that I would be giving if I had been called to the stand. The lawyers for Eric decided that two things happened. The state had presented an expert from the prison system who testified about conditions of life if people were to be sentenced to life in prison. And the attorneys believed that that witness had done a pretty good job talking about how secure Texas's prisons were, and how someone like Eric, who would be sentenced should he be sentenced to prison, would be incapacitated. He wouldn't be likely to be a future danger. Even though the testimony didn't specifically say that, his attorneys felt like that was probably pretty clear. They were worried that if I took the stand and testified that Eric was so remorseful, that it might make the jury angry because they had just been through a trial of innocence and questionable guilt, and there was a fear that there would be a boomerang effect and that they might actually be more enraged rather than more sympathetic toward Eric because of this charade that had just taken place for 3 days in the adjudication trial. So they chose not to call me, and I was thrilled. I was relieved because I was very, very, very anxious. I was out in the hallway with easily 35 or 40 community members from the community, all of whom were waiting to either testify or to hear the sentence because they were outraged and horrified by this monster who had lived amongst them. So I was in their presence waiting for all of this. They didn't know who I was, but I was very, very worried. So I was relieved when I didn't get called to testify.